The Small's Paradise Jazz Club on 7th Avenue was packed on that summer evening in 1970. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the smell of bourbon and expensive cologne. At a corner table sat Muhammad Ali, recently stripped of his heavyweight title for refusing the Vietnam draft, laughing with a group of Harlem locals. He was home here, among people who understood his struggle, who saw him not as a draft dodger, but as a man of principle. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you're enjoying this content, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers all around the world. The man who entered just after midnight was no ordinary troublemaker. Jack Ironside Morrison was a retired Navy SEAL with 2 tours in Vietnam under his belt and a chest full of commendations to prove it. But his military days were behind him now. Morrison had found new employment as head of security for Lucky Luciano's operations, a position that came with its own kind of power and prestige in certain circles. He carried himself like someone who had survived hell twice over, once in the jungles of Southeast Asia and again in the concrete jungles of organized crime. Morrison had heard Ali was in town, heard the champ frequented this spot, and he wanted to see for himself the man who had refused to serve. What he didn't know, what no one had bothered to tell him, was that Ali wasn't just any visitor to Harlem. The champ was there as a personal guest of Bumpy Johnson, and in Harlem, that meant something far more significant than any military rank or mob connection. Morrison moved through the crowd, his eyes fixed on Ali's table. The locals noticed him immediately. In Harlem, you learn to read people, to sense when someone didn't belong, when someone didn't understand the unwritten rules. This man had that look. The look of someone who thought his reputation traveled everywhere, who believed his credentials made him untouchable anywhere in America. He stopped at Ali's table without invitation. The conversation died. Ali looked up, his expression curious rather than concerned. Morrison's voice cut through the jazz music playing in the background, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "So you're the guy who's too scared to fight for his country, but you'll fight other men for money." The words hung in the air like a slap. Ali's companions tensed, but the champ himself remained calm, that familiar slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had heard worse, faced worse, from people with more power than one retired SEAL-turned-mob enforcer. But this wasn't just any club. This was Harlem. And in Harlem, disrespect carried consequences that had nothing to do with the law or the mob. "Brother, you seem lost," Ali said quietly, his voice lacking its usual boisterous energy. There was something in his tone, a warning that Morrison completely missed. "I ain't your brother," Morrison shot back. "Brothers don't abandon each other when the country calls. I served. I bled. What did you do? Hide behind a religion?" What Morrison didn't notice was the shift in the room. The piano player's hands slowed on the keys. The bartender stopped pouring mid-drink. The doorman moved quietly to lock the front entrance. Every local in that club knew what Morrison didn't. Muhammad Ali wasn't just a customer at Small's Paradise. He was Bumpy Johnson's personal guest. And disrespecting Bumpy's guest was the same as disrespecting Bumpy himself. From a booth in the back corner, a man in his 60s rose slowly from his seat. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson stood just under 6 feet, his frame still powerful despite his age. He wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than Morrison made in a month, even with Luciano's money, and he moved with the measured grace of someone who never rushed because he never had to. The room went completely silent. Even Morrison noticed this, finally sensing that something had changed, though he still didn't understand what. His hand instinctively moved toward his waistband, a reflex from years of training and his new line of work. Bumpy walked toward them, his footsteps the only sound in the entire club. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. When Bumpy Johnson walked, Harlem held its breath. Morrison might work for Lucky Luciano in other parts of the city. But here, in this neighborhood, there was only one man who mattered. He stopped beside Morrison, close enough that the former SEAL instinctively took a half-step back, his security training suddenly feeling inadequate. Bumpy didn't acknowledge him yet. Instead, he placed a gentle hand on Ollie's shoulder. "Everything all right, champ?" His voice was soft, almost grandfatherly. "All good, Bump," Ollie responded, relaxed now, leaning back in his chair. "Just a misunderstanding." Only then did Bumpy turn his attention to Morrison. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but something in them made the decorated warrior and mob enforcer realize he had made a terrible miscalculation. Lucky Luciano's name meant nothing here. His Navy SEAL background meant nothing here. This wasn't a combat zone where his training mattered. This wasn't a mob territory where Luciano's protection carried weight. This was Harlem, and he had just disrespected the wrong man's guest in the wrong place. "You work for Luciano," Bumpy said. It wasn't a question. He knew everything that happened in his city. Morrison nodded, trying to regain some of his confidence. "That's right. I'm head of his security." "Then you should understand respect," Bumpy continued, his voice never rising above conversational level. "You should understand territory. You should understand that when you enter someone else's house, you respect their rules. Or did they not teach you that in the SEALs?" Morrison's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Every instinct told him he was in danger, though no explicit threat had been made. Bumpy hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a move, yet the air felt heavy with menace. "This is my house," Bumpy said simply. "And the champ here? He's not just any visitor. He's my personal guest. That means he's under my protection. You disrespect him, you disrespect me." Morrison's face went pale. He suddenly understood the magnitude of his mistake. Working for Luciano might make him dangerous in Manhattan or Brooklyn, but here in Harlem, he had just insulted the one man whose word was law, and being Bumpy Johnson's guest meant Ollie had more protection in this neighborhood than the President of the United States. "Now," Bumpy said, his tone almost pleasant, "I think you have somewhere else to be." It wasn't a suggestion. Morrison knew it. Everyone in that club knew it. The former Navy SEAL, the man who had faced enemy fire without flinching, who had killed men with his bare hands, who now commanded Lucky Luciano's security forces, turned and walked toward the door without another word. His reputation, his military record, his mob connections, none of it mattered. He had been humiliated by an old man who never raised his voice, never threw a punch, never made a single threat. As the door closed behind Morrison, the music started up again. Conversations resumed. Ollie laughed and shook his head. "Bump, you didn't have to do that," Ollie said. "Yes, I did," Bumpy replied, sitting down at the table. "You're my guest, and in Harlem, that means something. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson earned the nickname Bumpy from a large bump on the back of his head, a physical mark that became as legendary as the man himself. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, he arrived in Harlem during the Great Migration, joining thousands of black Americans fleeing the Jim Crow South for the promise of opportunity in the North. Harlem in the 1920s was a world unto itself. The neighborhood pulsed with jazz, literature, and a cultural renaissance that put black art and intellect on the world stage. But beneath the glamour of the Cotton Club and the poetry of Langston Hughes, another Harlem existed, one where survival required more than talent or education. It required connections, muscle, and an understanding of power that no school taught. Young Bumpy learned quickly. He started as a runner for numbers rackets, delivering bets and collecting payments across the neighborhood. He watched, listened, and absorbed the lessons of the street with the focus of a military strategist. By his early 20s, he had caught the attention of Stephanie Saint. Claire, known as Queenie or Madam Queen, a formidable black woman who controlled a significant portion of Harlem's numbers game. St. Clair became Bumpy's mentor. She taught him that power in Harlem wasn't just about violence, though violence was sometimes necessary. It was about respect, about being someone the community could trust even if they feared you. When Dutch Schultz, a white mobster, tried to muscle into Harlem's numbers rackets in the 1930s, it was Bumpy who led the resistance. The war was brutal, but Bumpy's reputation grew with every confrontation. He wasn't just protecting his own interests. He was protecting Harlem itself from outside invaders. When Schultz was murdered in 1935, many attributed it to Lucky Luciano's orders. But those in Harlem knew Bumpy had played his part. The partnership that followed between Bumpy and the Italian mob was one of mutual respect rather than submission. Bumpy controlled Harlem. The Italians controlled everything else. This arrangement held because Bumpy made it clear that Harlem was not for sale, not for lease, not for the taking. Prison became a regular part of Bumpy's life. He served time in Sing Sing and Alcatraz, where he befriended another famous inmate, Alvin "Creepy" Karpus, a former public enemy who later said Bumpy was one of the smartest men he'd ever met. These prison sentences, rather than diminishing his power, somehow enhanced it. Each time Bumpy returned to Harlem, his legend had grown. He had survived what many men didn't survive. He had maintained his control from behind bars through a network of loyal associates who kept his operations running in his absence. But Bumpy was more than a criminal. This is what outsiders never understood. He invested in Harlem businesses. He funded local charities. During the Depression, he made sure families in his territory had food, even when the city government seemed to have forgotten they existed. Children knew they could come to Bumpy if they needed school supplies or winter coats. Store owners knew he would protect them from other predators, both criminal and institutional. He walked the streets without bodyguards, something almost unheard of for a man in his position. He could do this because Harlem protected him. The same community that feared his wrath also loved him for his protection. Old women greeted him on street corners. Men tipped their hats. He attended church services, not for show, but because he genuinely believed in something larger than himself, even if his life choices seemed to contradict that faith. By 1970, Bumpy was in his 60s, technically past his prime, but his power had not diminished. He had outlived most of his enemies and many of his friends. The younger generation of criminals in Harlem still sought his counsel, his blessing, his approval. He had become something between a godfather and a folk hero, a man whose very name carried weight. His code was simple but absolute. Respect was currency, loyalty was sacred, and anyone under his protection, whether they were a numbers runner or the heavyweight champion of the world, was untouchable. This wasn't sentimentality. This was the foundation of his power. People trusted that Bumpy's word meant something, that his protection was real, that crossing him had consequences that were swift and certain. When Muhammad Ali came to Harlem as Bumpy's guest, he didn't just gain the protection of one powerful man. He gained the protection of an entire neighborhood, a community that had elevated Bumpy Johnson to a status somewhere between crime boss and patron saint. And Jack Morrison, for all his military training and mob connections, had walked into that sacred space without understanding what it meant. Muhammad Ali's relationship with Harlem didn't begin with fame or fortune. It started with identity, with a young boxer named Cassius Clay searching for something beyond what Louisville, Kentucky could offer him. When he first visited Harlem in the early 1960s, before he changed his name, before he shocked the world by defeating Sonny Liston, he found a community that understood what it meant to be black in America, in ways his hometown never could. Harlem in the 1960s was the spiritual and cultural center of black America. It was where Malcolm X preached at the Nation of Islam's Temple No. 7. It was where James Baldwin wrote about the fire next time. It was where ordinary people fought daily battles against poverty, discrimination, and a system designed to keep them contained. When Clay walked those streets, he wasn't just another athlete passing through. He was a young black man trying to understand his place in a country that celebrated his talents while denying his humanity. The connection deepened after his conversion to Islam in 1964. The Nation of Islam had significant presence in Harlem, and Ali became a regular visitor to the temple. He met community leaders, activists, and people who saw beyond his boxing gloves to the man he was becoming. Malcolm X walked these same streets with him before their eventual split. These weren't photo opportunities or publicity stunts. These were formative experiences that shaped Ali's understanding of power, resistance, and what it meant to stand for something larger than yourself. When Ali refused induction into the armed forces in 1967, citing his religious beliefs and his famous statement that no Viet Cong ever called me NR, the establishment turned on him viciously. He was stripped of his title, banned from boxing, faced federal prosecution, and became a pariah to mainstream white America. But Harlem never abandoned him. When other cities wouldn't let him speak, Harlem opened its doors. When sponsors dropped him, Harlem businesses supported him. When the government tried to break him financially and spiritually, Harlem reminded him why his stance mattered. Bumpy Johnson watched all of this unfold. He saw a young man willing to sacrifice everything for principle, willing to lose millions of dollars and the prime years of his athletic career rather than compromise his beliefs. This was something Bumpy understood deeply. He had spent his life operating by his own code, refusing to bow to outside pressure, maintaining his independence even when submission would have been easier or more profitable. Their first meeting occurred through mutual connections in Harlem's interwoven social fabric. Someone who knew someone introduced them, as often happened in a neighborhood where everyone was connected by invisible threads of kinship, commerce, and shared struggle. Bumpy was immediately impressed. Here was a man who had everything to lose and chose principle anyway. Here was someone who understood that some things mattered more than money or comfort or safety. They formed an unlikely friendship. The aging crime boss and the exiled champion found common ground in their refusal to be controlled by systems that demanded their submission. Bumpy never asked Ali to compromise his beliefs. Ali never judged Bumpy for the life he led. They existed in separate worlds that occasionally overlapped in the unique ecosystem of Harlem, where contradictions lived side by side without apology. When Ali came to Harlem during his exile from boxing, he came as more than a celebrity. He came as family. Bumpy made it known throughout the neighborhood that Ali was under his personal protection. This wasn't a business arrangement. This wasn't about money or favors owed. This was about respect between two men who had chosen difficult paths and paid the price for their choices. Ali felt safe in Harlem in ways he didn't feel safe in most of America. He could walk the streets without fear. He could speak his mind without worrying about retribution. He could be himself, fully and completely, because Bumpy Johnson had declared him a guest, and in Harlem, that declaration carried the weight of law. This was the context Jack Morrison walked into that night at Small's Paradise. He saw a disgraced athlete. Harlem saw a protected brother. He saw someone to mock. Harlem saw someone to defend. The difference in perception would cost Morrison dearly. Jack Morrison's confidence that night wasn't born from ignorance alone. It came from a lifetime of achievements that would make most men feel invincible. He had graduated from Bud's S training, the Navy's grueling program that broke more men than it made. He had survived 2 tours in Vietnam, operating in conditions that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had killed men in combat, rescued fallen brothers under fire, and earned decorations that testified to his courage and skill. When he returned from Vietnam, Morrison found civilian life unbearable. The structure, the purpose, the clarity of military life had spoiled him for the messy ambiguity of peace. He drifted for a while, working security jobs that bored him, drinking too much, sleeping too little. Then, Lucky Luciano's people found him. They needed someone who could think tactically, who wasn't afraid of violence, who understood discipline and loyalty. Morrison was perfect. As head of security for Luciano's operations, Morrison commanded respect in Manhattan's underworld. Mobsters who wouldn't blink at killing a man thought twice before crossing him. He had the backing of one of the most powerful crime families in New York, and he had the skills to enforce that backing personally if necessary. In most of the city, his reputation preceded him. Doors opened. Problems disappeared. People got out of his way. But Morrison had never worked in Harlem. Luciano's arrangement with Bumpy Johnson meant the Italians stayed out of the neighborhood's internal affairs. They had business relationships that crossed the boundary, but they didn't try to control Harlem the way they controlled other territories. Morrison knew this intellectually, but he didn't understand what it meant practically. He thought power was universal, that his credentials carried the same weight everywhere in New York City. His attitude toward Ali was shaped by his military experience. Morrison had served his country when called. He had watched friends die in rice paddies thousands of miles from home. He had followed orders even when those orders sent him into hell. And here was Muhammad Ali, a man who had refused to serve, who had claimed his religion and his principles were more important than his duty. To Morrison, this was cowardice dressed up as courage, selfishness masquerading as principle. He genuinely believed he was doing something righteous by confronting Ali. In his mind, he was standing up for every man who had served, every soldier who had sacrificed, every family that had lost someone in Vietnam. He thought the people in Small's Paradise would respect him for it, maybe even thank him for saying what they were all thinking. This was his fundamental miscalculation. He assumed Harlem saw Ali the way mainstream white America saw him. He assumed the people in that club viewed Ali's refusal to serve as betrayal rather than resistance. He didn't understand that in Harlem, Ali's stance against the war was seen as heroic, that his willingness to sacrifice his career for his beliefs made him more respected, not less. Morrison also didn't understand that power in Harlem operated by different rules than power in the military or the mob. Military rank meant nothing here. Mob connections meant nothing here. Even violence, Morrison's most reliable tool, meant nothing if you didn't have the community's acceptance to use it. Bumpy Johnson's power didn't come from fear alone. It came from a complex web of respect, loyalty, and mutual obligation that had been woven over decades. When Morrison walked into Small's Paradise that night, he thought he was entering just another bar in just another neighborhood. He didn't realize he was stepping into sovereign territory, a place where his credentials were worthless and his assumptions were dangerous. He was about to learn a lesson that no military training had prepared him for. Bumpy Johnson didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The power in the room shifted the moment he stood up, like gravity suddenly pulling in a different direction. Everyone felt it. The piano player, the bartender, the couples at corner tables, even Morrison, though he didn't fully understand what was happening until it was too late. "You work for Luciano," Bumpy said again, studying Morrison with the calm attention of a doctor examining a patient. "Head of security, right?" Morrison nodded, trying to hold on to his confidence. "That's right." "Then you understand chain of command," Bumpy continued. "You understand that every territory has rules. You understand that when you enter someone else's house, you show respect." Morrison's jaw tightened. "I was just speaking my mind. This is America. I have that right." "You do," Bumpy agreed. "And I have the right to explain something to you. The champ here, he's not just some customer who wandered in off the street. He's my personal guest." "You understand what that means?" Morrison didn't answer. His hand had moved away from his waistband. Some instinct told him that reaching for a weapon here would be the last decision he ever made. "It means," Bumpy said, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, "that when you disrespect him, you disrespect me. And when you disrespect me in my own house, in my own neighborhood, that creates a problem." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Morrison noticed for the first time that every exit was blocked. Not obviously, not threateningly, but men had positioned themselves in doorways, near windows, at strategic points throughout the club. They weren't Morrison's enemies exactly, but they certainly weren't his friends. "I didn't mean any disrespect to you," Morrison said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of uncertainty. "But you did mean disrespect to him," Bumpy said, gesturing toward Allie. "You came into this club specifically to mock him, to belittle him, to make yourself feel bigger by making him feel smaller. That tells me you don't understand where you are." Bumpy took a step closer. Morrison was taller, younger, certainly more physically capable in a straight fight, but he felt himself shrinking under the older man's gaze. "Let me educate you," Bumpy said. "You see these people in here? They love the champ. They love him, because when the government told him to go kill people who never did anything to him, people who look like us, he said no. He said his principles mattered more than their approval. He gave up everything, his title, his money, his freedom, because he wouldn't compromise what he believed." Bumpy glanced back at Ali, who sat quietly, letting Bumpy handle the situation. That kind of courage, that kind of integrity, it means something here. It means more than all your medals, more than all your kill counts, more than whatever reputation you think you have. Morrison's face flushed red, but he stayed silent. "Now, you work for Luciano," Bumpy continued. "That's fine. Luciano and I have an understanding. He respects my territory. I respect his. But you just violated that understanding. You came into my territory and disrespected my guest. That puts Luciano in an awkward position, doesn't it?" The implication hung in the air. Morrison suddenly realized that this incident could cause problems between Bumpy and Luciano, and that Luciano would not be happy with the man who caused those problems. Morrison's value to the organization depended on him being an asset, not a liability. "I apologize," Morrison said stiffly. "I didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't ask," Bumpy said. "You didn't ask because you assumed your reputation was enough. You assumed wrong." Bumpy straightened Morrison's collar in an almost paternal gesture, the kind of thing a father might do for a son before sending him off to school. But there was nothing warm in the gesture. It was a reminder of how close Bumpy was, how vulnerable Morrison was, how completely the power dynamic had shifted. "Now," Bumpy said, stepping back, "you're going to walk out of here. You're going to go back to Manhattan. And you're going to think very carefully about what happened tonight. You're going to remember that there are places in this city where your credentials don't matter, where your boss's name doesn't protect you, where you're just another man who needs to learn respect." Morrison didn't argue. He didn't try to save face. He simply turned and walked toward the door. Every eye in the club followed him. The silence was absolute except for his footsteps on the wooden floor. As Morrison reached the door, Bumpy called out one last time. "And Morrison, if you're smart, you'll tell Luciano what happened here tonight. You'll tell him before he hears it from someone else. That way, maybe you keep your job." The door closed behind Morrison. For a moment, the silence held. Then someone laughed, nervous and relieved, and the tension broke like a snapped wire. The piano started up again. Conversations resumed. Life returned to Small's paradise as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. A lesson had been taught, And not just to Morrison. Everyone in that club had been reminded of how power worked in Harlem, who held it, and what happened when outsiders forgot their place. Bumpy returned to Allie's table and sat down. Allie was grinning. "Bump, you enjoy that too much." "Maybe," Bumpy admitted. But some lessons need to be taught clearly. Otherwise, people don't learn. Jack Morrison did exactly what Bumpy suggested. He went straight to Lucky Luciano and told him what happened. The conversation didn't go well. Luciano was furious, not at Bumpy, but at Morrison for creating a problem where none needed to exist. The arrangement between Luciano and Bumpy was delicate, built on mutual respect and clearly defined boundaries. Morrison had threatened that arrangement by acting like Luciano's authority extended into territory where it didn't. Morrison kept his job, but his reputation took a hit. Word spread through New York's underworld about what happened at Small's Paradise. A Navy SEAL, a decorated veteran, head of security for Lucky Luciano himself, had been humiliated by an old man who never raised his voice or threw a punch. The story grew with each telling, as stories do, until it became legend. In Harlem, the incident reinforced something everyone already knew. Bumpy Johnson's word was law. It didn't matter who you were, what you'd done, or who you worked for. If you came into Harlem and violated the code of respect, you paid the price. The fact that Bumpy had handled it without violence made the lesson even more powerful. He didn't need violence. His presence, his reputation, his absolute authority in that neighborhood were weapons enough. For Allie, the incident was just another example of why Harlem felt like home. These were his people. This was his protection. When the rest of America turned its back on him, Harlem stood firm. When the government tried to break him, Harlem held him up. The relationship was reciprocal. Ali gave Harlem pride. Harlem gave Ali sanctuary. Morrison never returned to Harlem. He stayed in Manhattan, did his job for Luciano, and eventually faded into obscurity. His military service, his decorations, his time as a mob enforcer, all of it became footnotes to the one night he walked into the wrong club and disrespected the wrong man. The story of that night lived on long after the people involved were gone. Old-timers in Harlem still tell it, usually with embellishments, always with pride. It's a story about power and respect, about understanding that different places have different rules, about the danger of assumptions. But more than anything, it's a story about what it meant to be Bumpy Johnson's guest in a world where Muhammad Ali had enemies in the government, enemies in the media, enemies in the public who saw him as a traitor. He had friends in Harlem, and those friends, led by a man who controlled the neighborhood with a combination of fear and love, made sure that anyone who wanted to disrespect the champ would have to go through them first. That protection was real. That night at Small's Paradise proved it.